Kia ora, nā mai ki te whare. Welcome to the House. Ko Lui Collins aho. Throughout most of January, Parliament was on its summer break. The buildings were pretty quiet, and when they were busy, it was mainly with cruise ship passengers and tourists instead of MPs. One part of Parliament that was bustling throughout the summer, though, was its website. The highly contentious and widely followed Treaty Principles Bill was open for submissions during December and most of January. As you've likely heard, the bill has smashed the previous record for most submissions out of the park. In fact, there was 150,000 submissions on one day alone, which by itself is more than the previous record of just over 100,000 total. This was for the Conversion Practices Bill when it went through Parliament in 2021. So what happens to all those submissions, how are they processed, and who decides what bits are used to report back to the House? To answer all those questions and more, last week I had a chat with Gabor Hillier, who is a principal clerk in Parliament's Select Committee office and has been leading the team working on the processing of all those submissions.
Kia ora, my name's Gabor. I'm a principal clerk in the Select Committee office at Parliament.
And what actually is a principal clerk?
So we have a team of clerks that support Parliament's Select Committees, and we have a few principal clerks that have a leadership role within that group.
So the clerks, if you ever go into a physical Select Committee meeting, they're the ones on that side table.
That's right.
On the laptops. Okay,
yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Parliament's back into 2025 and they're straight back into considering submissions and considering bills. With all the Select Committee submissions that have come across with the Treaty Principles Bill, they say that submissions are being processed. What does that actually mean? What does it mean to process the submission?
That's a great question. It can mean a few different things, but generally what we mean when we talk about processing submissions is the process of vetting them. So that's something that the Office of the Clerk committee staff do on behalf of the committee. And the process of vetting submissions is really about checking their consistency with parliamentary rules and the decisions of the committee about what they are happy to accept into their proceedings. So one example in the context of the Treaty Principles Bill is the committee made a decision that it would interpret Parliament's rule about offensive language in this context to mean that it didn't want to receive submissions with racist material. So that's one example of when we go through the submissions, we're looking for consistency with a number of different rules, but also committee decisions around swear words, racist language, abusive comments towards MPs and things like that.
I know in recent years there's been a lot of uptake in sort of template submissions. So if a submission is identical to one that's been already submitted, does that get sort of voided, or what happens to those submissions?
So how to deal with form submissions is always a decision for the committee. So in each specific case, committees will decide how they want to deal with submissions like that. In this particular case, the Justice Committee made a decision that anything that was submitted through the Parliament website would be counted as an individual submission, even if it was form-like in nature. For submissions that came through in hard copy, it was a little bit more varied in how they would treat the submissions. I think probably the usual practice is to do an analysis of the submissions to see what has been received and then make a decision about how to proceed. Yeah.
So once that's been processed and all vetted, what's the next step after that?
So after the submissions have been vetted, and we usually do this in batches, particularly when we have such a high volume, we will provide advice to the committee about submissions that we've identified that we think require some consideration by the members, and then the committee will go through its decision-making process to decide what it will accept and what it will return.
And then, so where does the ministry and officials come into all of that?
So the role of a ministry on a government bill is that they'll generally be appointed to advise the Select Committee, and their job really is to analyse the content of submissions for substantive analysis of the issues. So we're really looking at rules, parliamentary rules, and consistency with those. The officials from the ministry are looking at what have people said and how many people support the bill, how many people are opposed, and what sort of themes they're raising. The committee can ask officials for other types of analysis, but that tends to be the main things that they're looking for.
And so once they start having hearings, how are those 300,000 plus submissions condensed into the hearings. Who decides who's going to come along to Parliament or on Zoom and make an oral submission?
That's a great question. And again, it's the committee that decides. And actually, just earlier today, on the day that we're speaking, not necessarily the day people will be listening to this, the committee just released a media release explaining to the public how it plans to approach this in this particular case. So the committee noted that it's received over 16,000 requests for oral submissions. It's not going to be able to accommodate all of those in the time it has available. And so it's set out a process for how it's going to choose which submitters appear. And in this particular case, each party will be able to nominate 100 names. Those nominations will be collated by the chairperson and one other member, the Honourable Dr. Duncan Webb, and they will produce a list of people to invite to the hearings.
Right, okay. Now, I want to talk more broadly about the submission process in general. I'm sure for people that have worked at Office of the Clerk for 10 or 20 or even 5 years have seen a massive uptake and observed that, and that there's been so many more submissions than there were. I think in the foreshore and seabed there was only about 4,000, which at the time was quite a high amount. Do you think that that's a product of online submissions, or do you think there's more general public engagement in Parliament?
I think there's probably a few different things going on, but the rise of digital engagement and the ability for people to engage with Parliament through the website and the rise of social media that I think makes it easier to reach people. I think those are really big contributors, and you're absolutely right. In the last 10 years, we've seen an exponential growth in engagement with Parliament, which is great. That's the purpose of the public engagement process, but it can also obviously come with its challenges at times too.
What are those challenges?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the public engagement process at Parliament is really a digitised version of what has existed for a very long time. Individual people making individual submissions to a select committee. And so I think, and this is my personal view, I think the system's groaning a little bit under the weight of hundreds of thousands of submissions, which practically can't be treated the same as when the volume was a few hundred or a few thousand. And Parliament needs to be resourced to deal with that kind of volume. And I think Parliament at some stage will end up having a conversation about how it does engage with the public and whether that's all fit for purpose in the 21st century.
So it's sort of like a bit of a double-edged sword. You've got a lot more public engagement, but it obviously strains the staff that have to process it a lot more. With all the changes and with those considerations that there's a strain and everything, will Office of the Clerk meet and say, look, we've had 300,000 submissions, it's unprecedented and it seems to be trending upwards. What can we do to make the system more refined and streamlined?
So the main avenue for having those kinds of conversations is through the review of standing orders, which is Parliament's way of reviewing its own rules and how it's operating. So the Office of the Clerk of the House tends to make a submission to that review. So that review happens every 3 years, generally kicks off about 1 year before the election. So we would expect to see that kicking off later this year. That's really the place where you have representation from all parties, generally experienced members. The committee's chaired by the Speaker. And so that would be the first place where that conversation would happen. On top of that, I guess the Office of the Clerk, as an organisation that has a responsibility for providing services to Parliament, we're always looking at how we do what we do and how we can be most effective with the resources that we have within the rules that Parliament has set.
So could that meeting potentially be, could that spur a change of the Select Committee process as a whole, or just the submissions process?
It can lead to any kind of changes. So everything is governed by the standing orders at Parliament ultimately. And so, for example, in the last review, we had some very significant changes to the way select committees scrutinise the government of the day and the public service. So those were quite big changes. And I think if you sort of imagined what would it look like to have big changes for public engagement, you can see that it could go quite far potentially. That's not a prediction, just a kind of a comment on the rules at Parliament belong to the House, and so the House can change its rules and decide how it wants to arrange its work.
I guess what I've observed is the nature of the huge amount of submissions was, Some bills, the more sort of esoteric bills, you'll have experts come in and, constitutional lawyers, for example, the Parliament bill, didn't have the most submissions, more than probably expected, but you're getting people who are very knowledgeable about this particular subject. Whereas the Treaty Principles Bill and even sort of the fast tracking bill and recent bills like that have had these sort of petition-like submissions that are just, I support or I oppose this bill, and might have a little bit of elaboration, but quite minimal. Do you think that there'll be some sort of area where they have a special allocation for people that have a lot more sort of elaborate evidence?
It's a really interesting question, and the Standing Orders Committee has touched on this kind of issue before, really, about the different levels that people engage at. And so I wouldn't offer any predictions as such, but I would say that I think in thinking about this, you have to go back to the first principles of why we have public engagement. And I think it's a really positive thing that so many people want to engage with their elected representatives and the decisions that they're considering. I think it's just a question about how we make the best and most of that in a way that's meaningful, both for the people that want to engage, but also for Parliament. I guess just one other thing that I was thinking about is just how exponential the rise has been in the volume of engagement that Parliament's seeing. So obviously it's been publicly released that the volume of submissions on this bill is over 300,000. There was a really interesting submission on the Parliament bill, actually, which you mentioned earlier, from Mr. Will Dreyer, who is doing a PhD on select committees at the moment at Victoria University, and he had some numbers in his submission that he had himself, or as part of his PhD, had counted that in the previous parliamentary term, which is a 3-year period, Parliament received about 200,000 submissions, a little bit more than that. And the Parliament before that was just under 100,000. And obviously here on a single bill, we've got more than 300,000. So as I said earlier, there's multiple things that go into that increase in volume, but certainly there's a bit of a trend there. And it also just demonstrates the scale of the challenge of dealing with that volume. It's we have about 35 staff members in the Select Committee office, and we do a range of different things, not just vetting submissions. So we would have dealt with about 200,000 over a 3-year period, and here we're dealing with 300,000 in a much shorter period of time. So it just illustrates the scale of the work we're doing.
Right. So it's about, again, that balance of informing MPs to essentially make good laws and make good recommendations in that paper that goes back to the House, but then also have the public be heard.
I think so, yes. That's classically the two main functions of public engagement, is both to be instrumentally useful for the committee, but also to give effect to the committee and Parliament's role to engage with the people that vote for their representatives.
And is there anything else you would add as someone that's in the machine of it, to give people a sort of keyhole perspective of what it's been like, not just with the Treaty Principles Bill, but with the uptake and submissions over the past sort of 18 months, 2 years?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is it has been pretty busy. Other than that, I guess we do get a lot of correspondence from the public, people with questions about the process and about what's happening with their submission. I guess just to say that we really take our job of working with the public and responding to queries. We take all of that really seriously. Sometimes we can't get back to people as quickly as we'd like, but it's not for a lack of spirit or intention. It's just there's sometimes a lot going on. So if you haven't heard back from us, hopefully you will soon.
What happens to people's submissions who have, for example, selected that they want to come in for a hearing and they're not eventually selected for that, or they just don't select to be heard, but what if they still submitted? What happens to their submissions?
So, for example, if somebody makes a submission and doesn't request to make an oral submission too, those submissions go through the same vetting process as any of the other submissions. They will be at some point presented to the committee, who will make the decision to table them. That's the act of formally receiving them and releasing them, and that's when we can publish them online. and they'll be provided to the officials who've been appointed to advise the committee. They'll be analysed, and they'll form part of that overall analysis that the committee receives. On other bills, I think you can reasonably expect that members will read all the submissions that they receive, but obviously when you get up to the kind of volume that we're talking about here, it's unlikely that any single human being will have read all of the submissions. So, but certainly those submissions still influence the process and are considered.
That was Gabor Hellier, Principal Clerk for Select Committees at Parliament. I te whakaronga koe ki te whare. You've been listening to The House, a program made with funding from Parliament's Office of the Clerk. Mātua.